Chapter 1 of the Life of Washington, Volume 3, by John Marshall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Washington, Volume 3, by John Marshall, Chapter 1. Incursion into Jersey. General Lacy surprised. Attempt on Lafayette at Barren Hill. General Howe resigns the command of the British Army. Is succeeded by Sir H. Clinton. He evacuates Philadelphia and marches through the Jerseys. A council of war which decides against attacking the British on their march. Battle of Monmouth. General Lee arrested, sentenced to be suspended for 1 year. Thanks of Congress to General Washington and his army. 1778. The position at Valley Forge had been taken for the purposes of covering the country, protecting the magazines, and cutting off all supplies to Philadelphia. Although the intercourse of the inhabitants with that place could not be entirely prevented, the sufferings of the British army from the scarcity of fresh provisions and forage were considerable, and as the spring opened, several expeditions were undertaken, both to relieve their own wants and to distress the army of the United States. About the middle of March, Colonel Mawhood and Major Simcoe, who were detached into Jersey at the head of about 1,200 men, landed at Salem, nearly opposite Reedy Island, and dispersed the small bodies of militia who were stationed in that part of the country. General Washington had given early intelligence of this expedition to Governor Livingston, and had requested that he would immediately order out the militia to join Colonel Shreve, whose regiment was detached into Jersey, but the legislature had neglected to make provision for paying them, and the governor could not bring them into the field. Colonel Shreve, on his arrival at Haddonfield, the place at which they had been directed to assemble, found less than 100 men. March 23. Colonel Ellis, their commanding officer, remarked in a letter to the governor that without some standing force little was to be expected from the militia, who being alone not sufficient to prevent the incursions of the enemy, each one naturally consults his own safety by not being found in arms. Mawhood, of course, was unrestrained, and the devastation committed by his party was wantonly distressing. Its course of destruction was preceded by a summons to Colonel Hand, the commanding officer of the militia, to lay down his arms, which was accompanied with a threat of the consequences to result from his refusal. This threat was too faithfully executed. After completing his forage without molestation, Mawhood returned to Philadelphia. During the continuance of this incursion, which lasted 6 or 7 days, not more than 200 men could be collected to reinforce Colonel Shreve, who was consequently unable to effect anything, and did not even march to the lower parts of Jersey, which were plundered without restraint. May 1, not long after this incursion into Jersey, an enterprise was undertaken against General Lacy, who, with a small number of Pennsylvania militia, seldom amounting to 600, and sometimes not exceeding 50, watched the roads leading to Philadelphia on the north side of the Schuylkill, and was generally posted within 20 miles of that town. General Lacy surprised. This expedition was entrusted to Colonel Abercrombie and Major Simcoe, who avoided all the posts Lacy had established for his security, and threw a body of troops into his rear before he discovered their approach. After a short resistance, he escaped with the loss of a few men killed and all his baggage. His corps were entirely dispersed, and he was soon afterwards relieved by General Potter. To maintain the command of the water as far as was practicable, Congress had ordered impediments to be sunk in many of the rivers of common use, so as to obstruct the passage up them, and had constructed frigates and other smaller vessels to be employed above those impediments or elsewhere, as the occasion might require. Several of them had been commenced above Philadelphia, but were not completed when the British obtained the command of the river. General Washington then became apprehensive for their safety, and repeatedly expressed his desire that they should be sunk in such a manner as to be weighed with difficulty should any attempt be made to raise them. The persons, however, who were entrusted by Congress with this business supposed it would be equally secure to put plugs in their bottoms, which might be drawn out on the approach of danger. Against these vessels and some stores collected at Bordentown, an expedition was planned which ended in their total destruction. General Dickinson was in the neighborhood, but his force was too small to interrupt the execution of the design, and General Maxwell, who had been ordered to his assistance, was retarded in his march by a heavy rain, which did not obstruct the movement of the British, who passed up the river in vessels. May 18. To cover the country more effectually on the north of the Schuylkill, to form an advance guard for the security of the main army, and to be in readiness to annoy the rear of the enemy should he evacuate Philadelphia, an event believed to be in contemplation. General Washington detached the Marquis de Lafayette with more than 2,000 choice troops to take post near the lines. As this corps formed a very valuable part of the army, the commander-in-chief recommended in his instructions to General Lafayette the utmost attention to its safety, and particularly to avoid any permanent station, as a long continuance in one position would facilitate the execution of measures which might be concerted against him. The Marquis crossed the Schuylkill and took post near Baron Hill Church, 8 or 10 miles in front of the army. Attempt on Lafayette at Baron Hill. Immediate notice of his arrival was given to Sir William Howe, who reconnoitred his position and formed a plan to surprise and cut him off. On the night of the 19th of May, General Grant, with 5,000 select troops, took the road which leads up the Delaware and consequently diverges from Baron Hill. After marching some distance, he inclined to the left, and passing White Marsh, where several roads unite, took one leading to Plymouth Meeting House, the position he was directed to occupy, something more than a mile in the rear of the Marquis, between him and Valley Forge. May 20. He reached his point of destination rather before sunrise. Here the roads fork, the one leading to the camp of Lafayette and the other to Matron's Ford over the Schuylkill. In the course of the night, General Gray, with a strong detachment, had advanced up the Schuylkill on its south side, along the Ridge Road, and taken post at a ford 2 or 3 miles in front of the right flank of Lafayette, while the residue of the army encamped on Chestnut Hill. Captain McLean, a vigilant partisan of great merit, was posted on the lines some distance in front of Baron Hill. In the course of the night he fell in with 2 British grenadiers at 3 Mile Run, who informed him of the movement made by Grant, and also that a large body of Germans was getting ready to march up the Schuylkill. Immediately conjecturing the object, McLean detached Captain Parr with a company of riflemen across the country to Wanderers Hill, with orders to harass and retard the column advancing up the Schuylkill, and hastened in person to the camp of Lafayette. He arrived soon after daybreak and communicated the intelligence he had received. It was not long afterwards confirmed by the fire of Parr on the Ridge Road, and by an inhabitant who had escaped from White Marsh as the British column passed that place. Thus surrounded with danger, Lafayette took with promptitude and decision the only course which could preserve him. He instantly put his troops in motion and passed over at Matron's Ford, which was rather nearer to General Grant than to himself, without being intercepted by that officer or sustaining a greater loss than 9 men. General Grant, who reached the ground lately occupied by Lafayette soon after it was abandoned, followed his rear and appeared at the ford just after the Americans had crossed it. but finding them advantageously posted, did not choose to attack them, and the whole army returned to Philadelphia, having effected nothing. He did not escape censure for having allowed the great advantage he had acquired to slip through his hands unused. He might with the utmost certainty have reached Matron's Ford before the Marquis, and have cut off the only retreat which remained for him. But the same skill and address were not displayed in executing this plan as in forming it. In the statement of this affair made by General Lafayette, he represents himself to have advanced the head of a column towards Grant as if to attack him, while the rear filed off rapidly towards the Schuylkill. This movement gained ground even for the front, which, while it advanced towards the enemy, also approached the river, and at the same time induced General Grant to halt in order to prepare for battle. While this maneuver was performing in the face of the detachment under Grant, a small party was thrown into the churchyard on the road towards General Gray, which also gave the appearance of an intention to attack in that quarter. By these dispositions, happily conceived and executed with regularity, the Marquis extricated himself from the destruction which had appeared almost inevitable. In a letter to Congress, General Washington termed it a timely and handsome retreat, and certainly the compliment was merited. It might be supposed that this young nobleman had not displayed the same degree of military talent in guarding against the approach of danger as in extricating himself from it, but the imputation which generally attaches to an officer who permits an enemy to pass unobserved into his rear is removed by a circumstance stated by Lafayette. The Pennsylvania militia were posted on his left flank with orders to guard the roads about White Marsh. Without his knowledge, they changed their position and retired into the rear, leaving that important pass open to the enemy. General Howe resigns his command and returns to England, is succeeded by Sir Henry Clinton. This was the last enterprise attempted by Sir William Howe. He resigned the command of the army into the hands of Sir Henry Clinton, and embarked for Great Britain. About the same time, orders were received for the evacuation of Philadelphia. The part, it was now evident, France was about to take in the war, and the naval force which had been prepared by that power before she declared herself rendered that city a dangerous position, and determined the administration to withdraw the army from the Delaware. The preparations for this movement could not be made unobserved, but they indicated equally an embarkation of the whole army, or an intention to march to New York through Jersey. The last was believed by the American chief to be most probable, and he made every exertion to take advantage of the movement. His detachments were called in, and the state governments were pressed to expedite the march of their levies. In the meantime, Sir Henry Clinton hastened his preparations for the evacuation of Philadelphia, and the opinion that he intended to reach New York through Jersey gained ground. General Maxwell, with the Jersey Brigade, was ordered over the Delaware to take post at Mount Holly and to join Major General Dickinson, who was assembling the militia of that state for the purpose of cooperating with the Continental troops in breaking down the bridges, felling trees in the roads, and otherwise embarrassing the march of the British general. June 17. In this state of things, intelligence was received that a great part of the British army had crossed the Delaware, and that the residue would soon follow. The opinion of the general officers was required on the course now to be pursued. General Lee, who had been lately exchanged, and whose experience gave great weight to his opinions, was vehement against risking either a general or partial engagement. The British army was computed at 10,000 effective men, and that of the Americans amounted to between 10 and 11,000. General Lee was decidedly of opinion that with such an equality of force it would be criminal to hazard an action. He relied much on the advantageous ground on which their late foreign connections had placed the United States, and contended that defeat alone could now endanger their independence. To this he said the army ought not to be exposed. It would be impossible, he thought, to bring on a partial action without risking its being made general, should such be the choice of the enemy, since the detachment which might engage must be supported or be cut to pieces. A general action ought not to be fought unless the advantage was manifestly with the American army. This at present was not the case. He attributed so much to the superior discipline of the enemy as to be of opinion that the issue of the engagement would be almost certainly unfavorable. General du Portail, a French officer of considerable reputation, maintained the same opinions, and the Baron de Steuben concurred in them. The American officers seem to have been influenced by the counsels of the Europeans, and of 17 generals, only Wayne and Cadwallader were decidedly in favor of attacking the enemy. Lafayette appeared inclined to that opinion without openly embracing it, and General Greene was inclined to hazard more than the counsels of the majority would sanction. The country, he thought, must be protected, and if in doing so an engagement should become unavoidable, it would be necessary to fight. The British army evacuate Philadelphia and march through the Jerseys. On the morning of the 18th, Philadelphia was evacuated, and by 2 in the afternoon all the British troops were encamped on the Jersey shore from Cooper's Creek to Red Bank. Although they availed themselves to a great extent of the transportation by water, yet their line of march was so lengthened and encumbered by baggage, and the weather was so intensely hot, that they were under the necessity of proceeding slowly. Indeed, their movements wore the appearance of purposed delay, and were calculated to favor the opinion that Sir Henry Clinton was willing to be overtaken, and wished for a general engagement. As his line of march, until he passed Crosswicks, led directly up the Delaware, General Washington found it necessary to make an extensive circuit, and to cross the river at Coryell's Ferry, after which he kept possession of the high grounds in Jersey, thereby retaining the choice of bringing on or avoiding an action. June 24, as Sir Henry Clinton encamped at and about Allentown, the main body of the American army lay in Hopewell Township, about 5 miles from Princeton. Major General Dickinson, with about 1,000 militia, and Maxwell's brigade, hung on Sir Henry Clinton's left flank. General Cadwallader, with Jackson's regiment and a few militia, was in his rear, and Colonel Morgan, with a regiment of 600 men, watched his right. Notwithstanding the almost concurrent opinion of his general officers against risking an action, Washington appears to have been strongly inclined to that measure. He could not be persuaded that, with an army rather superior in point of numbers to his enemy, too much was hazarded by fighting him. Council of war, called by General Washington, decided against attacking the enemy on the march. The situation of the two armies was, therefore, once more submitted to the consideration of the general officers, who were asked whether it would be advisable of choice to hazard a general action, and if it would, whether it should be brought on by an immediate general attack, by a partial attack, or by taking such a position as must compel the enemy to become the assailants. If the council should be of opinion that it was unadvisable to hazard an engagement, then he asked what measures could be taken with safety to the army to annoy the enemy in his march should he proceed through the Jerseys. The proposition respecting a general action was decidedly negatived, but it was proposed to strengthen the corps on the left flank of the enemy with a reinforcement of 1,500 men, and to preserve with the main body of the army a relative position which would enable it to act as circumstances might require. In pursuance of this opinion, the troops on the lines were strengthened with a detachment of 1,500 select men, commanded by General Scott, and the army moved forward the next day to Kingston. Though the council had been almost unanimous against a general action, Several officers, whose opinions were highly valued, secretly wished for something more than light skirmishing. The opinion of the general against this decision. Knowing this, General Washington, who was still in favor of an engagement, determined to take his measures on his own responsibility. As the British army moved towards Monmouth Courthouse, he ordered Brigadier General Wayne, with an additional detachment of 1,000 select men, to join the advance corps. June 25. As the Continental troops, now constituting the front division, amounted to at least 4,000 men, he deemed it proper that they should be commanded by a major general. Lee had a right to claim this tour of duty, but as he had declared himself openly and strongly against hazarding even a partial engagement, and supposed that nothing further would be attempted than merely to reconnoitre the enemy and restrain plundering parties, he showed no inclination to assert his claim. Unintentionally promoting the private wishes of General Washington that the command should be given to an officer whose view of the service comported more with his own, Lee yielded this important tour of duty to Lafayette. The orders given to this general were to proceed immediately with the detachment, and after forming a junction with General Scott and taking command of the troops on the lines, to gain the enemy's left flank and rear, give him every practicable annoyance, and attack by detachment or with his whole force as the occasion might require. These dispositions and orders could scarcely fail to bring on an engagement. Wayne had openly supported that measure, and Lafayette, though against seeking a general action, had been in favor of a partial one. Of consequence, should any proper occasion offer, he would certainly attack with his whole force, which would as certainly produce such a state of things as would render it proper to support him with the whole army. June 26, immediately after the march of this detachment, General Washington moved to Cranberry, that he might be in readiness to support his front division. The intense heat of the weather, a heavy storm, and a temporary want of provisions prevented the army from continuing its march that day. The advance corps had pressed forward and taken a position about 5 miles in rear of the British army, with the intention of attacking it next morning on its march. Thinking this corps too remote to be supported in case of action, General Washington ordered the Marquis to file off by his left towards Englishtown. These orders were executed early in the morning of the 27th. Lafayette had scarcely taken command of the advance party when General Lee began to regret having yielded it to him. June 27. He perceived that, in the opinion of all the general officers, great importance was attached to it, and that his reputation was in danger of being impaired by connecting his strenuous opposition to even a partial action with his declining the command of a very strong detachment, which it was believed would engage the rear of the enemy. He therefore solicited earnestly for the command he had before declined. To relieve the feelings of Lee without wounding those of Lafayette, General Washington detached him with 2 additional brigades to Englishtown to support the Marquis. He would, of course, have the direction of the whole front division, which would now amount to 5,000 Continental troops. But it was expressly stipulated that if any enterprise had been already formed by Lafayette, it should be carried into execution as if the commanding officer had not been changed. Lee acceded to this condition, and with 2 additional brigades joined the front division of the army encamped at Englishtown. The rear division also moved forward and encamped about 3 miles in his rear. Morgan's corps still hovered on the right flank of the British, and General Dickinson on their left. Sir Henry Clinton occupied the high grounds about Monmouth Courthouse, having his right flank in the skirt of a small wood, while his left was secured by a very thick one and a morass running towards his rear. His whole front was also covered by a wood, and for a considerable distance towards his left by a morass. This position seemed unassailable, and the British were within 12 miles of the high grounds about Middletown, after reaching which they would be perfectly secure. Under these circumstances General Washington ordered Lee to attack the British rear the moment it should move from its ground. June 28. About 5 in the morning intelligence was received from General Dickinson that the front of the enemy was in motion. The troops were immediately put under arms, and Lee was ordered to attack the rear, unless there should be powerful reasons to the contrary. He was at the same time informed that the rear division would be on its march to support him. Sir Henry Clinton had observed the appearances on his flanks and rear on the 27th, and conjecturing that the American army was in his neighborhood, had changed the order of his march. The baggage was placed under the care of General Knyphausen, while the strength and flower of his army, entirely unencumbered, formed the rear division, under the particular command of Lord Cornwallis, who was accompanied by the commander-in-chief. To avoid pressing on Knyphausen, Cornwallis remained on his ground until about 8, and then descending from the heights of Freehold into an extensive plain, took up his line of march in rear of the front division. General Lee had made dispositions for executing the orders given the preceding evening and repeated in the morning, and soon after the British rear had moved from its ground, prepared to attack it. General Dickinson had been directed to detach some of his best troops to take such position as to cooperate with him, and Morgan was ordered to act on the right flank. Lee appeared on the heights of Freehold soon after Lord Cornwallis had left them, and following the British into the plain, ordered General Wayne to attack the rear of their covering party with sufficient vigor to check it, but not to press it so closely as either to force it up to the main body or to draw reinforcements to its aid. In the meantime he intended to gain the front of this party by a shorter road, and intercepting its communication with the line, to bear it off before it could be assisted. Martha Washington, from the portrait of Gilbert Stewart. After studying under Benjamin West, the American painter who succeeded Sir Joshua Reynolds as second president of the Royal Academy in London, Gilbert Stewart established a studio in Philadelphia, where he met and painted the first of his famous portraits of George Washington. This one of Martha Washington, the best-known likeness of her in existence, was painted in the city of Washington, where the artist had a studio between 1800 and 1802. She gave him several sittings at Mount Vernon. While in the execution of this design, a gentleman in the suite of General Washington came up to gain intelligence, and Lee communicated to him his present object. Before he reached the point of destination, there was reason to believe that the British rear was much stronger than had been conjectured. The intelligence on this subject being contradictory, and the face of the country well calculated to conceal the truth, he deemed it advisable to ascertain the fact himself. Sir Henry Clinton, soon after the rear division was in full march, received intelligence that an American column had appeared on his left flank. This, being a corps of militia, was soon dispersed, and the march was continued. When his rear guard had descended from the heights, he saw it followed by a strong corps, soon after which a cannonade was commenced upon it, and at the same time a respectable force showed itself on each of his flanks. Suspecting a design on his baggage, he determined to attack the troops in his rear so vigorously as to compel a recall of those on his flanks, and for this purpose marched back his whole rear division. This movement was in progress as Lee advanced for the purpose of reconnoitering. He soon perceived his mistake respecting the force of the British rear, but still determined to engage on that ground, although his judgment disapproved the measure, there being a morass immediately in his rear, which would necessarily impede the reinforcements which might be advancing to his aid, and embarrass his retreat should he be finally overpowered. This was about 10, while both armies were preparing for action. General Scott, as stated by General Lee, mistook an oblique march of an American column for a retreat, and in the apprehension of being abandoned, left his position and repassed the ravine in his rear. Being himself of opinion that the ground was unfavorable, Lee did not correct the error he ascribed to Scott, but ordered the whole detachment to regain the heights. He was closely pressed, and some slight skirmishing ensued, without much loss on either side. As soon as the firing announced the commencement of the action, the rear division of the army advanced rapidly to the support of the front. As they approached the scene of action, General Washington, who had received no intelligence from Lee giving notice of his retreat, rode forward, and to his utter astonishment and mortification met the advance corps retiring before the enemy without having made a single effort to maintain its ground. The troops he first saw neither understood the motives which had governed General Lee nor his present design, and could give no other information than that, by his orders, they had fled without fighting. General Washington rode to the rear of the division, where he met General Lee, to whom he spoke in terms of some warmth, implying disapprobation of his conduct. Orders were immediately given to Colonel Stewart and Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey to form their regiments for the purpose of checking the pursuit, and General Lee was directed to take proper measures with the residue of his force to stop the British column on that ground. The commander-in-chief then rode back to range the rear division of the army. He attacks the enemy at Monmouth Courthouse. These orders were executed with firmness, and when forced from his ground, Lee brought off his troops in good order and was directed to form in the rear of Englishtown. This check afforded time to draw up the left wing and second line of the American army on an eminence covered by a morass in front. Lord Stirling, who commanded the left wing, brought up a detachment of artillery under Lieutenant Colonel Carrington and some field pieces, which played with considerable effect on a division of the British which had passed the morass and was pressing on to the charge. These pieces, with the aid of several parties of infantry, effectually stopped the advance of the enemy. The action, severe but not decisive, finding themselves warmly opposed in front, the British attempted to turn the left flank of the American army, but were repulsed. They then attempted the right, with as little success. General Greene had advanced a body of troops with artillery to a commanding piece of ground in his front, which not only disappointed the design of turning the right, but enfiladed the party which yet remained in front of the left wing. At this moment General Wayne was advanced with a body of infantry to engage them in front, who kept up so hot and well directed a fire that they soon withdrew behind the ravine to the ground on which the action had commenced immediately after the arrival of General Washington. The position now taken by the British army was very strong. Both flanks were secured by thick woods and morasses, and their front was accessible only through a narrow pass. The day had been intensely hot, and the troops were much fatigued. Notwithstanding these circumstances, General Washington resolved to renew the engagement. For this purpose he ordered Brigadier General Poor, with his own and the North Carolina brigade, to gain their right flank, while Woodford, with his brigade, should turn their left. At the same time the artillery was ordered to advance and play on their front. These orders were obeyed with alacrity, but the impediments on the flanks of the British were so considerable that before they could be overcome it was nearly dark. Farther operations were therefore deferred until next morning, and the brigades which had been detached to the flanks of the British army continued on their ground through the night, and the other troops lay on the field of battle with their arms in their hands. General Washington passed the night in his cloak in the midst of his soldiers. The British employed the early part of the night in removing their wounded, and about midnight marched away in such silence that their retreat was not perceived until day. As it was certain that they must gain the high grounds about Middletown before they could be overtaken, as the face of the country afforded no prospect of opposing their embarkation, and as the battle already fought had terminated in a manner to make a general impression favorable to the American arms, it was thought proper to relinquish the pursuit, leaving a detachment to hover about the British rear. The main body of the army moved towards the Hudson. The commander-in-chief was highly gratified with the conduct of his troops in this action. Their behavior, he said, after recovering from the first surprise occasioned by the unexpected retreat of the advanced corps, could not be surpassed. General Wayne was particularly mentioned, and the artillery were spoken of in terms of high praise. The loss of the Americans in the Battle of Monmouth was 8 officers and 61 privates killed, and about 160 wounded. Among the slain were Lieutenant Colonel Bonner of Pennsylvania and Major Dickinson of Virginia, both of whom were much regretted. 130 were missing, but a considerable number of these afterwards rejoined their regiments. In his official letter, Sir Henry Clinton states his dead and missing at 4 officers and 184 privates, his wounded at 16 officers and 154 privates. This account, so far as respects the dead, cannot be correct, as 4 officers and 245 privates were buried on the field by persons appointed for the purpose, who made their report to the commander-in-chief, and some few were afterwards found, so as to increase the number to nearly 300. The uncommon heat of the day proved fatal to several on both sides. As usual, when a battle has not been decisive, both parties claimed the victory. In the early part of the day, the advantage was certainly with the British. In the latter part, it may be pronounced with equal certainty to have been with the Americans. They maintained their ground, repulsed the enemy, were prevented only by the night and by the retreat of the hostile army from renewing the action, and suffered less in killed and wounded than their adversaries. It is true that Sir Henry Clinton effected what he states to have been his principal object, the safety of his baggage. But when it is recollected that the American officers had decided against hazarding an action, that this advice must have trammeled the conduct and circumscribed the views of the commander-in-chief, he will be admitted to have effected no inconsiderable object in giving the American arms that appearance of superiority which was certainly acquired by this engagement. Independent of the loss sustained in the action, the British army was considerably weakened in its march from Philadelphia to New York. About 100 prisoners were made, and near 1,000 soldiers, chiefly foreigners, deserted while passing through Jersey. The conduct of Lee was generally disapproved. As, however, he had possessed a large share of the confidence and good opinion of the commander-in-chief, it is probable that explanations might have been made which would have rescued him from the imputations that were cast on him, and have restored him to the esteem of the army, could his haughty temper have brooked the indignity he believed to have been offered him on the field of battle. General Washington had taken no measures in consequence of the events of that day, and would probably have come to no resolution concerning them without an amicable explanation, when he received from Lee a letter expressed in very unbecoming terms, in which he, in the tone of a superior, required reparation for the injury sustained from the very singular expressions said to have been used on the day of the action by the commander-in-chief. June 30, this letter was answered by an assurance that, so soon as circumstances would admit of an inquiry, he should have an opportunity of justifying himself to the army, to America, and to the world in general, or of convincing them that he had been guilty of disobedience of orders and misbehavior before the enemy. General Lee, arrested for his behavior in this action, and afterwards to the commander-in-chief, on his expressing a wish for a speedy investigation of his conduct, and for a court-martial rather than a court of inquiry, he was arrested. First, for disobedience of orders in not attacking the enemy on the 28th of June, agreeably to repeated instructions. Secondly, for misbehavior before the enemy on the same day in making an unnecessary, disorderly, and shameful retreat. Thirdly, for disrespect to the commander-in-chief in 2 letters. Before this correspondence had taken place, strong and specific charges of misconduct had been made against General Lee by several officers of his detachment, and particularly by Generals Wayne and Scott. In these the transactions of the day, not being well understood, were represented in colors much more unfavorable to Lee than facts, when properly explained, would seem to justify. These representations most probably induced the strong language of the second article in the charge. Court-martial appointed to try him, sentenced to be suspended for 1 year. The court-martial, over which Lord Stirling presided, after a tedious investigation, found him guilty of all the charges exhibited against him, and sentenced him to be suspended for 1 year. This sentence was afterwards, though with some hesitation, approved, almost unanimously, by Congress. The court softened in some degree the severity of the second charge by finding him guilty, not in its very words, but of misbehavior before the enemy, by making an unnecessary and in some few instances a disorderly retreat. Lee defended himself with his accustomed ability. He proved that after the retreat had commenced, in consequence of General Scott's repassing the ravine on the approach of the enemy, he had designed to form on the first advantageous piece of ground he could find, and that in his own opinion, and in the opinion of some other officers, no safe and advantageous position had presented itself until he met General Washington, at which time it was his intention to fight the enemy on the very ground afterwards taken by that officer. He suggested a variety of reasons in justification of his retreat, which, if they do not absolutely establish its propriety, give it so questionable a form as to render it probable that a public examination never would have taken place, could his proud spirit have stooped to offer explanation instead of outrage to the commander-in-chief. His suspension gave general satisfaction through the army. Without being masters of his conduct as a military man, they perfectly understood the insult offered to their general by his letters, and whether rightly or not believed his object to have been to disgrace Washington and to obtain the supreme command for himself. So devotedly were all ranks attached to their general that the mere suspicion of such a design would have rendered his continuance in the army extremely difficult. Whatever judgment may be formed on the propriety of his retreat, it is not easy to justify either the omission to keep the commander-in-chief continually informed of his situation and intentions, or the very rude letters written after the action was over. The thanks of Congress presented to General Washington and his army for their conduct in the Battle of Monmouth, July 5. The Battle of Monmouth gave great satisfaction to Congress. A resolution was passed unanimously, thanking General Washington for the activity with which he marched from the camp at Valley Forge in pursuit of the enemy, for his distinguished exertions in forming the line of battle, and for his great good conduct in the action, and he was requested to signify the thanks of Congress to the officers and men under his command who distinguished themselves by their conduct and valor in the battle. After remaining a few days on the high grounds of Middletown, Sir Henry Clinton proceeded to Sandy Hook, whence his army passed over to New York. End of Chapter 1.